Hi, everybody. This blog post is going to be talking about mental health and the issues associated around it within the early childhood education settings and just within the education and classroom settings in primarily in elementary schools. There's a lot to say about mental health. It's a big movement that is getting a lot more research and a lot of attention in the schools, and it's something very positive because it used to be very hush hush when talking about mental health. It was almost seen as a sign of weakness before, but because new terminology and literacy is coming out of this, it's really nice to see that it's being embraced, it's being talked about, it's being addressed, and it's in a very holistic way, especially when we're looking at approaches from an Indigenous lens. And because this world is very much changing right now, Lori has done a lot of research and writing into the current context of it, and I'd love for her to share that.
Yeah, and just to back it up a little bit, Dylan's blog is, talking about the course, the free course for educators, teaching mental health with UBC, which I did take as well, and it was a very informative, really awesome course. He's done a really good job linking up that resource for all of you.
Thank you.
And so my work, I have been a strong advocate in the field of EC throughout my life. And when the pandemic hit, early childhood educators across the country were affected in different ways, but mostly were sent home without pay. Go on EI. We have no work, everything's shut down, there's no more daycares, and then they had to wait. Like, when will we get our jobs back? What's happening? We in Ontario came together and we started supporting each other in a weekly Zoom call. There was about 25 of us across the province, strong advocates, and within a community of practice. And so we were connecting and talking about the landscape. Childcare centres were shutting down. They were closing their doors. They couldn't stay open. We lost a lot of centres in Ontario. We lost a lot of educators. They said, okay, we're done. Like, we're not being valued. Now they want us to go back because they have emergency childcare setting up. The well-being of educators just dipped. They felt really unvalued. They were not being paid. They were expected to go to childcare, but their kids they had families and people, at home that they were worried about infecting with COVID, and many, many layers of no support for educators, which deteriorated the well-being of our educators. And we've lost a lot of people in our sector. So I actually wrote a paper with one of my fellow cohorts from the master's program here at UBC, who is a policy writer for the ministry in Nova Scotia in childcare. So Marianne Hudson and myself wrote on, social emotional learning and the well-being of educators through the pandemic and how to navigate that space. And I'm going to link up that article here. And we had talked about our experience and our role engaging with educators throughout the pandemic, and we talked about social emotional learning for the families and children, but also the educators, and how important it is. So today, as the pandemic is coming to an end, Canada has announced a childcare system for the country. And us advocates are still kind of feeling a little bit anxious because we know that as this is rolling out, there's not as much talk for what that system looks like for the early childhood educators. Will there be the pay raise that they need? And there's a huge gap in educators. We lost a lot of educators through the pandemic that were feeling unvalued and not recognized for their essential work, because then they became essential workers. And they had to go back to the childcare centers where teachers were treated differently than the early childhood educators. So, yeah, it's really important.
And multi-leveled issue as well. The health and safety of people is being valued and recognized, and really a prominent source of why those changes were happening. But because the focus was on that, the mental health aspect of it was largely overlooked. And because of that, it was creating these different sets of problems. And it was sort of like a perfect storm. And even still now, with us moving on our second year of the coronavirus, there are still these issues being manifested with that, the trauma that was associated with that. So how I'd like to engage with this conversation is bring it back down to how our classrooms can be addressing mental health issues. So I'm really happy that you were able to speak to the educator side of this, because we really do need to be taking into consideration. We're the ones that are on the front lines and really needing to be that motivator for our students. And sometimes it's certainly not easy to do that work.
No.
So with making sure that our students and our children are able to engage fully in this world and have a strong sense of mental well-being, I find that in my own Indigenous culture, how I've come to know and address these things is working on the philosophy of the medicine wheel. So the philosophy of the medicine wheel is that it is a circle with a component of 4 different areas. So north, east, south, and west. Summer, spring, fall, and winter. And the 4 sacred animals, and the 4 sacred medicines, and the 4 sacred parts of a human being, which I want to speak to now. So that is the emotional self, the spiritual self, the mental self, and the physical self. So with how mental health is understood in my culture and how I've internalized that with my spirituality, is that all 4 of those components of a human being, that physical self, the mental self, the spiritual self, and the emotional self, all need alignment. They all need consistent attention. One area does not deserve any more recognition than any others, because they start negatively affecting them. So if you are taking too much time to consider your spiritual self, but you're neglecting your physical self, you're going to be running into problems. So when it comes time to look at your mental self, you need to understand that if that area is being negatively affected in some way, perhaps take a look at how your physical self is being affected, your spiritual self is being affected, and your emotional self is being affected, and how different areas in your life can maybe be tweaked or addressed in certain ways that you can have a more holistic balance between those areas. And what I found profoundly important and has gotten a really good reaction out of me and other people when speaking of the medicine wheel is the simplicity of it. Simply looking at the symbol, which I'm going to put down below in the blog here, it really gives you an understanding of how the body and the mind works in an entire human being, and how those areas really are inescapable. There's not anybody that doesn't have one of those areas. So
there's a really good medicine wheel that the Indigenous early childhood educators created during the pandemic on wellness. So we'll link that PDF up, and it talks about how everything is interrelated, interconnected, and how we bring balance as educators to ourselves, to and our families.
And just to wrap it up, it's nice to see that curriculum documents are reflecting mental health issues, and specifically Indigenous mental health issues. And to have those incorporated with our health lessons is really important, because our students do deserve the literacy behind these mental health issues like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and so on. And it's a good time to be working on those things, educating our students on them, because they may fall victim to them at some point in their life, and we really do need to prepare them to be able to face those issues. So perhaps down in the comments below, if you would like to share a bit about mental health strategies that you utilize in your classroom that have been quite effective, or perhaps even in your own personal life.
Yeah, and also the medicine wheel teachings anybody can take up, in a good way. You'll be able to relate to the wellness and the wheel of being, and if it speaks to you, definitely. You can kind of start mapping out those areas where you need to support yourself physically and mentally within the medicine wheel, which is how we would use the tool ourselves. So we'll leave a blank one there as well.
Absolutely.
And that if anybody feels like taking it up and kind of looking at that landscape for themselves. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.